Thank you so much, NK, and I'm humbled by the introduction that you did. And thanks the entire 3i leadership circle, as well as obviously the entire 3i fraternity for providing this platform. So let me just dive directly into, it's a little bit of a dense subject, but let me see if we'll be able to do justice in the time that we kind of laid out for it. Uh, you see on this introduction, I say an enterprise architect's viewpoint. And I think it becomes a little important for me to emphasize this because typically in any business today, which is, as you can look at today, the focus is largely on instant gratification, the social viability. Our utility as an enterprise architect typically failed when something adverse happens. Like, for example, the other day there was the service vulnerability exploited and some PII data that was available on the darknet. We also have seen things like data vulnerability due to poisoning, data poisoning, and prompt engineering. And that typically tricks models into providing results that may reveal some sensitive information. It directly has a connotation to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability dimensions in the data security space per se. Or also, we've started seeing a lot of the impersonation attacks due to the gaps in implementation of, say, a responsible AI practices leading to its adversarial use. Now, typically, as an enterprise architect, this is a subject of immense importance to me, and as also a guiding place for me to be able to engage with my clients. I think all of you will be aware, and I think NK pointed out earlier during my earlier conversations that typically the concept of a capability and maturity model germinated out of the software and system engineering disciplines from the hallowed precincts of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, typically in the late 80s. And that trigger was more driven by DoD's ask to ensure the contracting entities are reliable enough to engage with. And obviously, I think all of us are aware of the CMM, CMI, and the PCMM, and now the resiliency engineering model that cover the field. But the next gen solution, which is typically around AI, Gen AI, predictive analytics, blockchain, combination of all these services, typically still remain to be fairly nascent. Although there's a lot of work happening, especially 2024 was a watershed year in Carnegie Mellon for engaging with the Department of Defense once again to see how this can be brought in for, say, warfare simulation and things like that. So in my session today, I aim to lay out a capability maturity framework, and I'll explain this combination of capability maturity as I go ahead, which I typically use with my clients for evolving the state of readiness prior to architecting their next gen strategy rollout. I think another important aspect is because I work on a program directly with Carnegie Mellon on bringing together a framework on contract management and the outsourcing industry, maybe around 2.5 decades back. I think that also gives me some grounding in terms of typically how such frameworks are brought into play. So let me just dive further into the conversation. So typically, when we look at an architect viewpoint looks at not just implications of instant needs that we are kind of looking at, but also looks at how the whole ecosystem evolution intends to happen over a period of time. So having worked with maybe multiple organizations across the world, uh, I've tried to look at a combination of my personal experiences or my collective experiences with my teams and a lot of global research, which is kind of pointing to certain directions. So this is more of a summation of my point of view. This may not be an exact reflection of maybe what we're seeing there, but basically, how do we envision a world in 2020, 2050? And as an architect, it's important that when we build organizational capabilities, we build the capabilities to be able to sustain for at least 2 to 3 business cycles, because typically that's where the robustness of any capability framework comes into play. Now, the underlying imperative for any sustainable initiative is to address the needed capabilities and to define the progression, especially with the changing ecosystem. So you'll see maybe this graph talks about a series of imperatives, right from maybe the global GDP impact because of next gen solutions and its impact on maybe, for example, the overall global GDP, or the innovation research ecosystem, the increasing digital divide, and how that kind of finally dovetails into a more equal regional integration, and other specific elements which are immediate imperatives when we look at any of these programs, which is typically around things like sustainability, because of so much of GPUs, TPUs being brought into play, and therefore maybe the burn that they bring in, the ethical risks, and we're seeing a lot of them happening as we speak now, the privacy risks that will come into play, the whole evolution of the changing workforce reforms, which will be there, typically driven on the need for a completely redefinition of the education system, and obviously uh, we are talking about how to generate more predictive, more specific, more hallucination less outcomes, while ensuring that we are able to maybe do a better vectorization and maybe a better derivative of maybe a output per se. So obviously, I think you also have seen how suddenly earlier this year, with DeepSeek coming to play, it kind of disrupted this whole principle of large infrastructure capacity is needed, and then obviously followed by, like, I think in February, Microsoft announced the Majorana one quantum chip. So we are seeing a lot of what we are expecting happening much more faster and in real as we speak now. Now, keeping these in mind, obviously, it is important that uh, we build these into definition of capability framework. And I have been fortunate to have got engaged with two pioneering organizations in the Indian ecosystem, uh, dwelling on trying to address some of the issues that you kind of face here. First, one of them is basically a entity which is developing high performing LLMs, typically delivered on edge devices, with scalable configuration ranging from about maybe 100 million to 8 million parameters, good use of quantization, and typically redefining what's possible at the AI edge while still retaining accuracy and proper responsiveness per se. Now, this is called as the Shakti LLM, and you can actually maybe look through it at some point of time, which typically powers on the device intelligence while seamlessly addressing enterprises use cases, especially across maybe cloud as well as on premise deployment. Another interesting one, you'll see maybe some announcements of that happening fairly soon, is about moving beyond just creating multi-dimensional database to basically have a unifying relational vector graph, time series, and document storage DB, especially with a true multimodal platform. Now, this is something which is in the same direction as Milvus or Pinecone or Quadrant, for that matter. And you'll see some discussions happening about it. I may not be able to tell you the name, but I think the things are happening fairly soon on the social network per se. And the good part is that so these are like typically from your typical innovation hubs around Bangalore, Hyderabad, and things like that. Now, when we look at all this, this is therefore a very amazing time for the businesses to think through the capability approaches, looking at the challenges, and uh, focus on very specific practices uh, by design, not as an afterthought, but typically by design as an integral thought process of their whole progression per se. Now, another important assumption that is the need for the firm grounding of next-gen adopters is the basic maturity for strategy, business process, governance, IT in systems, support processes, and organization development process. I think NK also introduced that as a part of his initial discussion. So in my experiences, these practices typically do the foundation. And as I go to my next slide, it also defines the state of readiness from a prepared state to drive ROI for the next gen practices. Now, let me kind of go to this slide and take you through my thoughts on how this whole framework has been evolved. So, uh, so this is something that I've now been using for about maybe a little over 3 years. In fact, 5 years, but its evolution has happened, especially over the last maybe 2 years, significantly. So this is I think, designed with an intent that we are typically seeing a quicksand approach, especially today, because there's so much of change happening. It's imperative that the organization today kind of brace themselves by establishing capabilities that surmount these challenges. As I was mentioning earlier, my experiences kind of lay across the pharma, healthcare, microfinancing, and the aviation sectors. And typically, I try to see how the framework has its fitment cross domains, as well as ensure that it brings in the validation of the practices and the relevance to an organization. Um, I labeled this framework as a skyscraper framework, not primarily just because of the way the framework looks at this point of time, but also because of a core intention behind it, which is what I tried to kind of mention on the slide also, that typically deep below, and it's an architect's perspective. So typically deep below into the foundational elements, if you were to look at it, or activities that are orchestrating various entities in the organization that generate the needed transformation for the business outcome. I think that's one very deep, and as we saw, it's maybe an inch wide and a mile deep approach that we look at. And therefore, one element is that the foundation's strength becomes a critical element for maybe like a building to sustain for maybe a long period of time. And the other important aspect is this, to be able to continuously, therefore, not lose the vision and gaze what is happening in the environment, all from a perspective of gauging your own strengths, your own weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. Typically, thus driving the initiatives that that are typically addressed in this dimension. That's why I call it skyscraper, because it defines the depth and defines the breadth of coverage needed from an organization standpoint. Now, it's also important for the listeners or to the audiences on the call today that they appreciate the specific differences between capability and maturity. And this is important because coming from Carnegie Mellon's ecosystem there, I think it's imperative that we understand that part. So you'll see on the bottom series of capabilities that I've mentioned: strategy and differentiation, to business focus, to innovation ecosystem, and so on and so forth. Uh, these capabilities typically deliver process predictability and outcome. So therefore, the way you kind of see it here, we've kind of scaled it into a capability scale of 5 elements, moves from ad hoc, defined, implemented, managed, and improving. That means for each practice, you have to go through this scale of 5 to ensure that your capability, that particular capability, like for example, say movement from a cross-functional efficiency, predictive alerts, and human in the loop led practices to maybe, for example, an agentic AI led reinforcement learning and human feedback for improved efficiencies in the process management area. If you were to look at those two combinations, we are saying that it's important that you were able to move through that process of ad hoc, define, implemented, manage, and improving. And once you've done that for a particular capability, on top of that, you build the maturity and say that you're prepared, you've initiated, you're operational, you're perceived or influencing. Now, just so that maybe we have a quick definition, I kind of laid it out also here that when you look at the 88 practice and across the maturity level, when we look at the prepared level, it is typically foundational capabilities, but foundational capabilities built on top of a current state of maturity. That means, for example, we can't have a lax software and system engineering process being followed, and yet say that we are ready, we are prepared to adopt the next gen opportunities. Or maybe we have a proper labeling, indexation, and everything of the data that system has from perspectives of both its business utility as well as from perspective of governance and control, to be able to say that we are prepared to adopt, say, a next gen solution. So that's why it's important that the foundation capabilities are no longer a typical foundation capability in a maturity or CMMI, because there we start from a perspective that the organization is in an ad hoc state. What we're saying is the organization is already in a stable state, and therefore its ability to uh, kind of absorb such changes will help. And it typically goes into, therefore, an initiated place where you look at business first view. Therefore, you move away from single POC ad hoc elements to maybe something which are more specific and defined. Then you go into maybe operational elements, which are more platform driven centricity, with which with a very well-defined, deeply ingrained ways of governance and responsible AI to be brought into play. Finally, moving into what we're calling as the pervasive state of maturity for the organization, where we talk about across function adoption, bringing in market collaboration and trying to look at maybe a co-innovation, co-development initiatives and things like that. And the intent, therefore, it moves away from just simple efficiencies and cost management to growth and differentiation. I think that's typically a very interesting dimension from an outcome standpoint. And finally, when we look at influencing, typically this is where, as an entity, we should be able to start positively impacting how we are able to influence the base construct, like for example, a target addressable market itself. Just because we have been able to maybe uh, understand customers' requirement better, just because we have now an ability to generate and innovate faster, we should also be able to maybe start addressing those areas. This is very, very interesting, especially in domain that I work, because, for example, in pharma, life sciences, uh, the speed at which a new molecular entity gets churned out uh, and will get impacted because of this ecosystem as we move ahead, especially with maybe, for example, pattern recognition, visual impacts, and so on and so forth, especially at a cellular level. A lot of those evolution will start happening much more faster, and therefore maybe start solving more problems that the human ecosystem handles today. So typically, these are this is this focus from a maturity framework standpoint, and the way we are doing is being robust capability. And once you build the base capability, start building on top by adding a layer of maturity, and you go further till maybe what we're calling as the prepared to influencing life cycle. These capabilities also have been designed into, or maybe kind of split into maybe three large sections. We're calling them as strategic capabilities, as you can see there on the slide, operational and governance capabilities, and then typically outcome-centric capabilities. And you'll see that in outcome-centric capabilities, and if you relate back to my previous slide on challenges, things around sustainability and customer and market impacts will come into play. When you look at, maybe, for example, operational governance entities, things around responsible AI, ethical practices, and other elements will come into play. Now, it's it's just one segue that I want to bring in here, and then we move to maybe the next slide. So typically, when you look at a framework of this nature, and you look at, maybe, for example, practices around data architecture and governance, or technology architecture and resilience, um, the need for responsible AI and ethical AI with deep-rooted practices on observability and explainability. And I think this is a very important aspect, because one of the key derivatives from the last year's think tank at Carnegie Mellon was around how do you bring in explainability. They discussed about the low rank adapters and reducing the weight spaces and equivalent for the tasks, and overall auditability, because those are the ones that will make more confidence in people to adopt the framework, and therefore those become the imperatives and areas of focus that we want to maybe bring in when we look at an evolution of an organization using this framework. So let me now move further to the next part of defining what these 88 practices are. So I'll not be able to go through all 88, but I'll maybe try to define to you the way I look at what characterizes an organization at a state of maturity from prepared to influencing. Uh, Now, at the first stage, when I say prepared, you'll see a few things there. Like, for example, the intent is to move away from ambiguous, short-sighted, sometimes non-existing Gen AI strategy. Typically, one of the reasons why we saw, I think, a term used was the POC graveyard, was because a lot of what we were doing there were trying to maybe uh, look at solving a point issue, but not looking at enterprise scalability. And therefore, an important imperative, even at prepared stage, is that we should move away from these short-sighted uh, approaches to a more pervasive enterprise roadmap, which means that we are moving away from siloed POCs to more cohesive function segment level focus. Like, for example, the domain that I work on, uh, in, say, the pharma commercial or R&D, are very interesting domains. In case of, for example, the peer ecosystem, revenue cycle management is a very important domain, and it has great leverage points to use Gen AI and related next gen capabilities. Or when you look at, maybe for example, the aviation sector, things like operation control center, and therefore predicting potential impacts on operations due to, maybe for example, a weather impact or a geopolitical issue, uh, are becoming very important imperative, because all of them have a direct connotation to an impact on the consumer, which is the customer. Plus, they also have a time to market impact, and more importantly, they also have, maybe for example, a direct revenue impact that the organization will start seeing. So therefore, it's very important that we move away from those uh, small POCs to a more segment or division level view, or a more department level view, and therefore maybe bring controls there. The other characteristic at a prepared phase is that a lot of times these initiatives that we undertake in the next gen area, uh, the spend on organizational development, change management, and the related areas typically almost 2x the cost of maybe the basic initiative itself. And therefore, it's important that we build these practices of organization change readiness, having a redesigned blueprint done, or maybe, for example, what should be the skill gap and how do we address the skill gap to be kind of brought in play effectively at the very early on stage of the life cycle. The other elements that characterize maybe like typically a prepared entity is areas around, maybe for example, governance, risk and compliance, and therefore measurable value around risk, security and ethics. You'll see maybe the GRC tower is a big tower in this area. Similarly, for example, in the whole data architecture area also, it's a big tower, simply because between GRC and data architecture, we look at things around trust, risk, security, and typically these are areas that typically intend to bring in things such as, for example, prompt monitoring, security, hallucination control, bias control, things around, for example, what they call the hate, abuse, and profanity inclusion. And then, more importantly, these build the framework for things like, for example, an IP protection or ecosystem collaboration. So that's a quick perspective in terms of what we see in the prepared phase, state of maturity for an organization for those same capabilities. If you move it to the initiated phase, you will typically see an organization characterized by especially a lot of focus of converting that strategic integrated viewpoint into a more quantifiable ROI and RO, basically a return on opportunity driven approaches. So this is something which is very interesting. And but in conjunction to that, uh, it's also important to note that a lot of times organizations here might have some growth centric initiatives that they will be still focusing on, but predominantly they are looking at things around cost optimization, efficiency improvement, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a clear view that I've seen across maybe over 20 plus odd assessments I've done using the same framework. The other important element is that we realize that as a capability, uh, an organization alone cannot have everything in house, and therefore it's important that we look at how do we bring in a more tighter ecosystem integration. And typically that's where we'll come in two important elements. One is the innovation ecosystem, and the other one is basically the supplier ecosystem. So it's important that somewhere we look at how do we use things like, for example, in integration with, or rather basically engagement with the academia, the innovation labs, for experimentation, rapid prototyping, or also maybe use things like smart contracting and regulatory frameworks. And this is typically where maybe blockchain becomes a very interesting piece, especially around effective governance and risk management from a supplier ecosystem standpoint. Those are very interesting capabilities that you'll see typically happening in this particular in this area. Obviously, what is also important is that we are finally transforming from maybe the definition of an entity on the data architecture and governance standpoint to a more focus on data quality, integration, and interoperability. Plus, also we move into maybe a more stringent zero trust framework with focus on maybe the areas around automated CI/CD, the AI ops practices, and auditability. Now, these are like what we're calling is that so you are now having all the ingredients for you to be able to move into the next stage. One important aspect of this phase also is that you start doing the life cycle impact assessments, typically from a sustainability standpoint. And as we speak now, I think there are very interesting projects happening across the world around the construction industry, in the aviation sector, with maybe targets to 2030 and the 2050 target, especially around various initiatives, including the safe the aviation fuel changes, and therefore maybe more efficient engines and everything that are coming into play. So that typically defines our second state of maturity, and that's how maybe when we look at this, we kind of evaluate them, saying, okay, you have these capabilities, therefore you have met the requirement for a maturity level initiated, which we call it. Now, interesting one thereafter is what we call as the operational level practices that come into play. Now, this one is a little, this one goes a little deeper and is a little more uh, outcome centric in nature. Like, for example, you'll now see that, especially in the business focus area, there are focus around differentiation, personalization, and dynamic pricing and such strategies, cross-channel sales strategies, and others that come into play, typically with an intent that how do you influence the lifetime value. uh, and this is happening not just from a perspective of a customer's standpoint, but typically it's also happening from a perspective of investment going in, and therefore what's the outcome that investment delivered, as a case in point. Another interesting aspect, and I think some of you who have been familiar with the balanced scorecard, when you look at the strategy here, you look at maybe, for example, an operational measurement framework. So the way we've designed this, it covers the customer, the internal operations, typically internal operations, thing like finance, legal, uh, other support functions, and so on and so forth. That'll come into play. Then we have maybe, for example, functions specifically around maybe finance objectives, the learning and development objectives, and also the ecosystem sustainability. Typically, this is where it's important that we start now recognizing very effectively the contribution from the innovation ecosystem, the human capital management, and OD, organization development practices that come into play, and more importantly, also from the supplier ecosystem, because you are as good as you've been able to maybe orchestrate a ecosystem which helps you achieve your objectives per se. An interesting aspect that you see here also is that there is a process transformation with a focus on predictive analytics led efficiencies and human in the loop led intelligent automation. So we're seeing this as something happening at this stage, and as we kind of progress further, we'll see certain other things that will come into play. So this typically reflects what we are calling as the operational state. So which means that the practice that you put in place are now start yielding results. They are measurable. You have the necessary guardrails in place for data governance, and you have necessary controls in place from an aspect of auditability and explainability and everything else, as a part of maybe, for example, the resilience infrastructure that you put in play. So that typically defines this phase. Now, as we move into maybe the next layer, which is typically at a pervasive level layer, uh, this is a very interesting shift, because you typically are moving towards a more measurable, continuous innovation-led improvements, and and you and you're doing this leveraging and contributing to the open innovation. Like a lot of times, organizations, if you see, there's a parallel of this in the automotive sector in terms of maybe co-innovation and co-development, especially around engines and whatever. Or you see in the aviation sector, for example, uh, a set of maybe 3 or 4 key entities do the entire innovation and drive maybe how the engines will kind of be brought together. So a lot is happening of this nature uh, in maybe in maybe, for example, the discrete manufacturing area, especially in automotive, aviation, and a few other areas that come into play. But we will see a more pervasive adoption of this through open innovation and open contribution, especially, for example, in areas around pharma, life sciences, and equivalent. And I see we start happening. So you've seen maybe collaborative ecosystem in pharma coming in play, Microsoft playing an important role with a lot of other entities and so on and so forth. So we see that all happening there. Another important shift that we see here is that we're typically moving on the process management from typically into a more continuous adaptation, leveraging the reinforced learning and human feedback for more improved efficiency. So this is a interesting play because we, for the first time, start now also looking at the maturity around the agentic AI frameworks. So we have them operational currently, but how to what level do we define the autonomy to be able to maybe manage it? And there are processes fairly effectively in use case fairly effectively that will be happening, which going to address this particular area. Another important aspect that we see there is that we move into a more, especially on the data architecture and governance standpoint, into a more managed warehouse supporting both structured and unstructured data at scale. This is a very interesting element because this, to a large extent, is a big trigger from an aspect of innovation and therefore maybe change amenability and so on, so that come into play. Another interesting aspect is around the resilience on the technology layer, especially with respect to the decentralized, autonomous, and real-time self-healing, self-managed decisioning that may happen in that particular area. We've had an interesting conversation on the AI ops a few weeks back, and I think that lends itself very effectively to maybe where the framework fits into play. Besides, obviously, on the governance, risk, and compliance, you'll see cross-functional governance with focus on ethics, sustainability, traceability, and self-improvement triggers that are kind of brought into play. So that's one interest. That's an aspect. And finally, maybe this is maybe the first time I'm talking about the customer and market impact, because this is an area where you start moving into a more cohort or a group to a more hyper personalization approach. And I think this is possible only this is possible only if maybe we have the ecosystem in place, the foundation in place to be able to get to that stage. If we intend to do this earlier, we'll typically be maybe either unidimensional or not having looked at all dimensions, and therefore maybe end up leading to practices which may not be mature and therefore effective. And finally, when we look at the pervasive layer, you'll see that not each of the capability groups have a pervasive practice put in play. And that's primarily driven by the fact that those have to be in place for us to be able to move into an influencing state, which is typically our fifth level of maturity. So you'll typically see that while from a strategy and business focus, which is typically led by buyer behavior understanding and increasing the target market, the target addressable area, which is what you see on the customer dimension side here. It becomes an interesting output of what you would have done on strategy differentiation and business focus and the process maturity per se. The other important aspect you see there is that you move into a state where you move towards contribution to on the regulatory foresight and standard development, because you have been there, done that, you have seen the pitfalls, and therefore you are in a position to start defining what controls should be put in play there. The other important aspect that I think we're bringing in here is, and maybe it's for the first time I kind of brought in here, is around the human capital management and especially around the organization development area on aspects around economic parity and workforce development with economic parity as the kind of focus in place. Now, this is, if you remember in the challenges, this was one of the things that we had seen there. And what our realization is that it is a combination of organization change with the right skill gap and organization and human resource management practices, which will lead to a more embracing adoption of next gen practices by organizations. And I think from that standpoint, it becomes important that when you do that, you basically widen the horizon or the scope of your view of the organization. And because you're doing it, you therefore are willing to adopt this change and become ready or maybe relevant for ensuring that you are able to contribute. And typically that's where it becomes important that we somewhere start influencing the workforces for inclusive economic development. Another important aspect that you'll see here is co-innovation hubs with suppliers, and a significant focus on autonomous governance across process, data, technology, and compliance. So that is that's in a summation what the capabilities will contribute to an outcome that they intend to deliver. What I've also done is, as a conclusion to my session, is brought up a quick use case of an engagement that been involved in, especially in the aviation sector. This is on, say, the AI-led operating system for the aviation sector. Important aspect that I want to kind of bring in here is that this organization typically at a level 3, which is operational state of maturity. Obviously, they have practices in other levels also, in level 4 and 5 too also. But typically, they reflect and state that typically the strategy is led by a next-gen solution, which means that personalization, multimodal, order and offer, uh, addressing the operation control center and the revenue managers are typically ingrained in their way they do their product development, or they do the product conceptualization and movement. Data management has a focus around maybe well-defined, master-driven data, labeled, segregated, controlled data, which has been put in play, plus strong governance and a level of some real-time adaptation of data pipelines, especially around the transaction event flows and unstructured data that will be brought in play. And this is very interesting because this is an important aspect from a standpoint of we will deliver something which aggregates information from both structured and unstructured data from operation systems and the global sensory element that are being looked at, and be able to convert them into one decision framework. So that's a very interesting element that we've seen there happening. From a technology and after resilience, obviously the intent is to bring in multi-tenancy and to look at adversarial attack detection and mitigation. So that's an interesting capability that we brought in play. Supply governance, obviously through smart contracts and more focus on responsible AI in conjunction with the supplier, with strong governance around that. Value stream mapping led approach for automating and self-optimizing workflows. And finally, maybe the human capital design is around learning and development focus to uh, ensure that they understand this whole AI-driven operating system ecosystem they intend to bring in play. So typically, when we do an exercise of this nature, these are the kind of outcomes that you will be able to see. Typically, at the level of maturity at the bottom, you'll see a series of graphs around their state of readiness on those that 12 areas, 12 capability areas, and also maybe where do they stand with respect to maybe their status on the maturity scale. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. I would like to thank you and would be willing to collaborate to use this framework, especially for your organization, for maybe area that you would want to kind of bring focus on. And maybe let's see if it makes sense to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vivek. It surely makes sense. Who can deny the value enterprise architecture that can add? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can. Yes.
So it's very tempting to ask an enterprise architect, like, you have a cluttered canvas given in a legacy organization versus a clean canvas that you get when you get to a new age organizations or a startup. So which is more interesting and challenging for an enterprise architect?
So, see, what happens is, I would say a startup ecosystem is more challenging for an enterprise architect,
Okay.
because what is happening is that in a legacy organization, at least you have a view of the current processes and how they intend to operate. Versus in a startup, to a large extent, some of these are also envisioned views. That means they are not yet operational natures. They are not given an output in the form of an operational performance metric. They have not identified the vulnerability that they typically get exposed to, and so on and so forth. So I think that becomes a bigger challenge. But if you do a comparison between a startup to legacy, but in legacy, the organizational change impact to make them adopt this could be more higher than maybe compared to a startup. So, but as an architect, I will maybe find lesser challenges with the organization which is already legacy and operational.
Even when you look at maybe aging systems that exist with the legacy organizations, or as you said, there is that resistance to change that would be there, and even with respect to
Yes.
data, with silos and fragmentations. So, and also the challenge between innovation versus sustaining their
Yeah.
continuing business,
Yeah.
business
Yeah.
continuity. So,
Yeah.
don't you see these as bigger challenges?
So that's why I said that organization change
Mm,
becomes a challenge in those entities, but
right.
not so much an ability to make them see. Because what is happening is today, fortunately, maybe a few years back, say about 2 decades back, I wouldn't have been able to say that the good enough technologies evolved to address how do you do legacy migrations, or how do you continue to coexist with legacy and bring in modern systems.
Correct.
I remember a great piece of work we did in a discrete manufacturer in Australia,
Mm,
where we did we did the modernization of their complete ERP, but their manufacturing execution system was on a typical old archaic system. It would not take instructions from the ERP. So
okay.
we designed a middleware layer to do that integration, right? Which means that you will still be able to derive the same benefits of a seamless planning, execution, quality control, and traceability and outcome generation.
Mm.
Uh, Yet you may not have modernized the system, because modernized system may be more cost and more risk than maybe able to continue sustaining it. I think currently our technology gives us the ability to maybe handle that part, but
But
human
don't you
change
think that
doesn't.
a very fast changing technology
Hmm.
world, isn't
Hmm.
that a challenge when it comes to giving an enterprise architecture? You have to keep on revisiting because there is so much of
Yes,
advancement happening in
yes.
AI.
No doubts about it. So I think a typical life of an EA today is spend maybe at least 30% to 40% of re-equipping ourselves,
Absolutely.
and only maybe 60 to 50%, or maybe 60% to 70% maybe doing what we are supposed to be doing.
Mm.
So that's how we have to do. Otherwise, we'll kind of stop being relevant.
I agree. See, I think this is what you emphasized, when you brought in pretty nice slide, which where you spoke about, what characterizes an organization to stay relevant
Hmm.
with the next gen solutions, wherein you spoke about prepared versus initiated, operational,
Hmm.
and I guess even pervasive and influencing. So I think
Hmm.
that is where you touched upon several characters that an
Yes.
organization
Yeah.
should focus on to stay
Yeah.
relevant.
Yes, correct. That's why I said that in this, the takeaway is that when you look at the maturity, while you obviously have to do the hard grunt work of implementing the capabilities, you will have to also look at why you're doing those capabilities.
Absolutely.
So therefore, what is your takeaway at a level becomes an important aspect. And I think that's what I wanted to focus on by summarizing what does the organization look like when it is at a prepared level to maybe, for example, a influencing level. Because if that's not direct, if you don't want to do the influence level, that's nobody's forcing you. But what is forcing you is that, for example, should you want to be at the prepared level, then are you really looking at the capability across those 5 dimensions of ad hoc to improving for that capability, and ensure that you achieve that level of depth and control on the capabilities for that area. So that's how the design has been done. So it doesn't enforce you to do maturity scale. It doesn't say that you always go that direction. But what it says that if you want to go direction, these are the foundational before you step to the next layer. And therefore, that split on a capability model and a maturity model brought together in the frame.
How difficult it is to sell in the boardroom, Vivek, because it-
If you were to ask me, my first 4 or 5 engagements, very difficult.
very difficult. Yeah.
Yes, very difficult.
Mhm.
Because what will happen is that a lot of times people will start correlating this to it's an aspect of compulsion. Like, for example, when the CMI was adopted in the US, it
Mm.
was probably adopted because it was ingrained as a part of a basic qualification for the supplier to bid,
Correct.
right? So it was something driven by that. It's not so much driven by the fact this is organization really wanted to improve,
Kind of
right? But
hygiene factor type.
yeah, correct. But I had a very interesting time between 2003 to 2007, when the framework on contract management that was authored, where I co-authored along with Carnegie Mellon and a few other entities there, we took it out to various organizations. And we took it out to various organizations, not with a caveat that you get a certificate, but with the fact that can you relook at your practices and see how you want to improve it. Right. So don't look at certification will follow through. It's like saying the certification is a hygiene factor that will come through. But are you able to do this effectively? So I remember one of the largest aviation entities in Australia was one such entity, which focused predominantly on the contract management with its partner ecosystem. And we sold the model to them at that point of time, primarily with an intent to bring in a much tighter governance and better outcomes to contract. So that's how the sell happened. Or, for example, one of the largest conglomerates who in South Korea, when they adopted it with the intent that they want to differentiate their IT services and systems compared to other chaebols that they call it in that market. So the cell was, one cell was better outcomes and governance. The other cell was differentiation. So we have to therefore look at such hooks and then do the selling at the board. As mentioned, the first 4 or 5 engagements were really tough. But if there is a historical evidence, I was saying that this organization was able to achieve this, and therefore you will be able to get this, is what has helped me facilitate the sell today.
Absolutely. Surely, I would like to take advantage of this, Vivek. The enterprise architects are the rare species. It's not so easy to find them or to nurture them. So there are so many members and participants out here who are dreaming or who are looking at this as a career aspect. So what would be your suggestion, how to evolve into an enterprise architect and how to train your mind to look at this as as a whole enterprise-wide thinking than looking at a specific problem? So how do you guide them, or how do you suggest them to evolve into an enterprise architect?
So it is all basic principles. See, as I think you answered the question in the question itself, right? So see, if as human beings, we should have basically 2 things: our ability to sense, select, and act, which is typically look at the environment and see what is happening and be able to understand and reflect and be able to put it into our, what you may call as a random access memory as an individual. That's important. The second part that we have to look at is that be inquisitive, ask questions. See, because like I had a very interesting conversation yesterday where we were discussing about doing a price master. And price master, in my definition, is something which is a controlled master, which means that it has to have ownership by a single entity or maybe a defined set of entities who have an ability to follow the CRUD principle, basically the ability to create, update, delete, or whatever that matter. And it should never be permitted to go to be done by anybody and everybody in the ecosystem, because finally what's happening is this is an auditable entity that exists in the organization. So I had a contrarian viewpoint being asked from the client, and then basically what you have to do is you have to basically say, okay, so I'll lay out the risk in front of you. These are risks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This may happen if you do this, but I still want to understand why you want this. Because see, what's important is, as an enterprise architect, I have to look at, can I design a solution to address that need? So can I maybe, for example, bring in something called as a like a interim pricing model, which is not the price master, but basically which holds various price elements over a period of time for the same item, changed by any entity which exists in the ecosystem. So then you start looking at solutioning by saying, okay, I keep the control element out. I bring in an interim play, which maybe for example, what do you call it? It's not something which is governed, but it is something which is more get this operational. So typically that's how the brain works. So I said that typically do the send select tag, understand the ecosystem, understand what the client is, keep on asking those foolish questions. And I've realized that maybe a lot of times that helps me solve, get to maybe the root of the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. One more last point I wanted to touch upon, Vivek, is in one of the slides, when it comes to the outcome-centric capabilities. So obviously, you mentioned sustainability. This is something that is really picking up pace, and there are a lot of questions being asked. There's a lot of effort being, but it's still blurry for people. First of all, to understand how important it is for an organization, and how to go about it. So, what's your current gauge of this particular capability? Is it getting the required importance and attention, and how people are going about it?
Okay, a little bit of your voice broke, but if I understood the question, you are asking how does sustainability, like what is the current gauge in terms of is adoption or understanding effectively cross organizations?
Correct. And are people really giving the required importance to it?
Yes. So see, sustainability current. So sustainability in the next maybe a couple of years, or maybe the next 5 years, will become an imperative. It'll almost become like a contractual obligation. Right. So whatever said and done today, people may not want to do whatever they want to do, but it will typically assume that state very, very soon. True. Because obviously now the governance is happening from a very different perspective. So as I mentioned, in the 4 sectors that I mentioned that I've been playing in, obviously the aviation sector, it will delayed in its adoption, but it's very, very serious in its move towards sustainability. And this does not only mean sustainability practices from a standpoint of the aviation fuel and the operation cost, but also basically the level 2, level 3. That means the airport that they use, and also maybe influencing through the wastewater management and waste management and community development. And all those elements that come into play, typically through maybe their touch points, like an employee who stays in a society and so on and so forth. So it is becoming pervasive. And you'll now, obviously now, if you look at, so because I'm also a qualified, like what do you call from IOD as a qualified board member, or an independent board member. That also, if on the entity that I sit on the board today, it very clearly is there that now governance, risk and compliance, and sustainability are integral part to any of your annual reportings or submission that you do to the regulator, for that matter, anything that you do with, say, a red herring report and everything that has to happen for a new IPO, which means that this is integral. This is now like a compliance. This is like maybe the auditing compliance element that can be driven. So in all practical purposes, you'll see this to be adhered to.
Very interesting to know. So obviously now the enterprise architect should have an attention to this metric also. So thank you very much, Vivek, for this all-round information around the whole enterprise architecture and also the capability maturity framework, especially for the organizations that are looking at the next-gen solutions. Thank you very much for bringing this very interesting topic. I'm sure this will be just the nuggets for people to go and do homework on and to learn more about it, around to know what's happening and how to go about it. So thank you once again for coming on this platform with this topic.
Thank you, and thanks NKU, Samir, and Kapil, and for providing us this platform. And I look forward to maybe engaging with you as we go forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Vivek, and thank you everyone for coming on to this session. And we'll bring another session next week. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.